Chapter 30, Charlie's Chocolate Factory. The great glass elevator was now hovering high above the town. Inside the elevator stood Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe, and little Charlie. "How I love my chocolate factory," said Mr. Wonka, gazing down. Then he paused and he turned around and looked at Charlie with the most serious expression on his face. "Do you love it too, Charlie?" he asked. "Oh, yes," cried Charlie. "I think it's the most wonderful place in the world." "I'm very pleased to hear you say that," said Mr. Wonka, looking more serious than ever. He went on staring at Charlie. "Yes," he said, "I'm very pleased indeed to hear that you say that. And now I shall tell you why." Mr. Wonka cocked his head to one side, and all at once the tiny twinkling winkles of a smile appeared around the corners of his eyes. And he said, "You, my dear boy, I have decided to make you a present of the whole place. As soon as you're old enough to run the entire factory, it will become yours." Charlie stared at Mr. Wonka. Grandpa Joe opened his mouth to speak, but no words could come out. "It's quite true," Mr. Wonka said, smiling broadly. "I'm really giving it to you. That's all right, isn't it?" "Giving it to him?" gasped Grandpa Joe. "You must be joking." "I'm not joking, sir. I'm deadly serious." But why should you want to give the factory to little Charlie?" "Listen," Mr. Wonka said. "I'm an old man. I'm much older than you think. I can't go on forever. I've got no children of my own, no family at all. So who's going to run the factory when I get too old to do it myself? Someone's got to keep it going, if only for the sake of the Oompa Loompas. Mind you, there are thousands of clever men who would give anything for the chance to come and take over for me, but I don't want that sort of person. I don't want a grown-up person at all. A grown-up won't listen to me. He won't learn. He will try to do things his own way and not mine. So I've decided to have a child. I want a good, sensible, loving child one, to whom I can tell all the most precious candy-making secrets while I'm still alive." "So that's why you sent out the golden tickets," cried Charlie. "Exactly," said Mr. Wonka. "I decided to invite 5 children into my factory, and the one I liked the best at the end of the day would be the winner." "But Mr. Wonka," stammered Grandpa Joe, "do you really truly mean that you're giving this whole enormous factory to little Charlie? After all—" "There's no time for arguments," cried Mr. Wonka. "We must go at once and fetch you the rest of your family. Charlie's father and his mother and anyone else that's around. They can all live in the factory from now on. They can all help run it until Charlie's old enough to do it by himself. Where do you live, Charlie?" Charlie peered down through the glass elevator at the snow-covered house that lay below. "It's over there," he said, pointing. "It's a little cottage right on the edge of the town, the tiny little one." "I see it," cried Mr. Wonka, and he pressed some more buttons, and the elevator shot down towards Charlie's house. "I'm afraid my mother won't come with us," Charlie said sadly. "Why ever not?" "Because she won't want to leave Grandma Josephine and Grandma Georgina and Grandpa George. They must come too." "And they can't," Charlie said. "They're very old and they haven't been out of bed for 20 years. "Then we'll take the bed along with us, as well as them, with them in it," said Mr. Wonka. "There's plenty of room in the elevator for the bed." "You couldn't get the bed out of the house," said Grandpa Joe. "It wouldn't go through the door." "You mustn't despair," cried Mr. Wonka. "Nothing is impossible. You watch." The elevator was now hovering over the roof of the Bucket's little family. "What are you going to do?" cried Charlie. "I'm going right in to fetch them," said Mr. Wonka. "How?" asked Grandpa Joe. "Through the roof," said Mr. Wonka, pressing another button. "No!" shouted Charlie. "Stop!" shouted Grandpa George. Crash went the elevator right down through the roof of the house into the old people's bedroom. Showers of dust and broken tiles and bits of wood and cockroaches and spiders and bricks and cement went raining down on 3 old people who were lying in bed. And each of them thought that the end of the world had come. Grandma Georgina fainted, Grandma Josephine dropped her false teeth, and Grandpa George put his head under the blankets. And Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came rushing in from the next room. "Save us!" cried Grandma Josephine. "Calm yourself, my dear wife," said Grandpa Joe, stepping out from the elevators. "Only us." "Mother!" cried Charlie, rushing into Mrs. Bucket's arms. "Mother, Mother, listen to what happened. We're all going back to live in Mr. Wonka's factory. We're going to help him run it, and he's given it all to me. And what are you talking about?" said Mrs. Bucket. "Just look at our house," cried poor Mr. Bucket. "It's in ruins." "My dear sir," said Mr. Wonka, jumping forward and shaking Mr. Bucket warmly by the hand, "I'm so very glad to meet you. You mustn't worry about your house. From now on, you're never going to need it again anyways." "Who's this crazy man?" screamed Grandma Josephine. "He could have killed us all." "This," said Grandpa Joe, "is Mr. Willy Wonka himself." It took quite some time for Grandpa Joe and Charlie to explain to everyone exactly what had been happening to them all day. And even then, they all refused to ride back to the factory in the elevator. "I'd rather die in my bed," shouted Grandma Josephine. "So would I," cried Grandma Georgina. "I refuse to go," announced Grandpa George. So Mr. Wonka and Grandpa Joe and Charlie, taking no notice of their screams, simply pushed the bed into the elevator. They pushed Mr. and Mrs. Bucket in after, and they got themselves in. Mr. Wonka pressed the buttons and the door closed. Grandma Georgina screamed and the elevator rose up off the floor and shot up through the hole in the roof into the open sky. Charlie climbed onto the bed and tried to calm the three old people who were still petrified with fear. "Please don't be frightened," he said. "It's quite safe, and we're going to the most wonderful place in the world." "Charlie's right," said Grandpa Joe. "Will there be anything to eat when we get there?" asked Grandma Josephine. "I'm starving. The whole family's starving." "Anything to eat?" cried Charlie. "Oh, just you wait and see."